Welcome to Authors at BCFG. We are so excited for this inaugural event. And actually, in the interest of time, though I know folks are still joining, I'm just going to get started. You already know a little bit about Authors at BCFG because you signed up for it. But what brings our diverse community together is an interest in the science of behavior change and the science of behavior change for good, meaning lasting behavior change, and also especially relevant to the talk today about the greater good. And it's my honor to just do the introduction of our distinguished speaker, and then Katie is going to handle the interview and facilitate Q&A as well from all of you. Here's a short version of Jay Van Bavel. You thought it was Van Bavel, didn't you? So did I. But no, Professor Jay Van Bavel is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU, New York University. From neurons to social networks, Jay's research investigates the psychology and neuroscience of implicit bias, group identity, team performance, decision-making, and public health. Many publications, many popular writings as well. But here's the little personal story that I just remembered when making notes for this introduction. So Jay and I were at an actual, real, in-person scientific conference that feels like a million years ago. And we had dinner together. And Jay, you didn't have money on you. And I was like, no worries, I'm going to pay for it, which I did, and then didn't think about it again. And then Jay, I think you spent much of the rest of the conference looking for me so that you could make me whole. And we did eventually find each other again. And you are much more than that, but I was like, oh yeah, I do remember that funny little thing. And I hope we get to have dinner again in person. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And thanks for buying me drinks that one day.
Yeah, you owe me, by the way.
Trust me, I won't forget about it. I pay my debt.
Yeah. All right, good. All right, Katie, over to you.
I am so excited that we get to do this. And I should say, I have your amazing book up on my bookshelf. It was such a fun read. And I know someone is going to put into the chat in a moment just a link to the book website so that anyone who's interested and hasn't already gotten their copy can go grab one. I absolutely loved it. I am going to start with a softball question, which is telling us why you wrote this book. And then I'll throw some harder ones at you. But why did you do it? It's great.
Yeah, I think I never had aspirations to write a book. So I don't think that was the reason. The real reason is I stumbled into this conversation with Dominic once. I was visiting him, and we were friends from graduate school, and we did our postdocs together as well. And moved and became professors at the same time and parents at the same time. And I was visiting him, and he was talking about a book club he was part of, and some book they had read in his local community or neighborhood book club. And it was a social science book, and he said it was really good, but it didn't really flow together very well. And I started defending the author. I said, at least they wrote a book. It's so hard to do and very impressive. And he said, you could write a book. And I was kind of startled. And I said, what would I write a book about? And he said, about your research about identity and groups. And that got me thinking about it on my ride home. And I started mentally on my drive that night, thinking what all the chapters would be. And I emailed him when I got home and I said, let's do this. And, since that time, that was 5 or 6 years ago, it feels like identity has become such a major issue around so many topics in society, around politics and race and nationality. And so during the time we've been writing it, I think my goal and our goal collectively is to try to help people understand how groups are operating. It feels like there's a huge desire to understand how they operate in the real world, but also at work, and to give people the tools to make smarter groups and more inclusive groups. So that's fundamentally the mission we have behind our book.
I love that. And by the way, I should say to everyone in the audience, I'm going to turn it over to you in a little bit, in that we're going to turn to audience questions about 20 minutes in. But if you start now by entering your questions into the Q&A box, we'll be curating them in the background. So feel free, whenever something comes to mind, go ahead and put it in, and we'll turn to your questions in a minute. But first, more of my questions. That was a wonderful explanation of why you wrote this book. I would love it, actually, if you would tell everyone the hilarious story, I should say, of how you and your co-author, Dominic, became fast friends, and also what you think that story actually teaches us about identity. I think it's a great anecdote.
Okay, great. So this is the preface of our book. So if anybody who's kind of started reading it, this is the first 10 pages. It's kind of the origin story, which people love, the origin stories about how individuals got into, certain types of research. Our origin story, which is about us, how we formed a collaboration, and our book is fundamentally about collaboration. So originally, Dominic was a year ahead of me, and he had started his PhD the prior year to me at the University of Toronto. And when I came to the university, I had to pick an office. And he was in this really nice office. Admittedly, it was kind of in the sub-basement, which is the basement below the basement, and it had 3 desks, and 2 of which were open. So I immediately grabbed one of those desks and started moving in. The very next day, I brought my hockey equipment. So I was a hockey player. This was in Canada. I had a huge bag of goalie equipment, and I brought it in and said, I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to store this here. I have such a tiny apartment. There's no room for it. And he looked at me with, complete disdain, but he didn't say anything. He's like this polite, kind of like traditional English upbringing. And it turns out that he really despised me for about 6 months. I don't think he turned around in his chair to talk to me. And it wasn't until like a few months after that we were like having a wine and cheese colloquium after this, guest speaker had come to university, and we're talking about ideas with some other students. And, I was a poor graduate student. And so I was like eating as much of the hors d'oeuvres as I could. And I think I had like a free glass of beer. So I was really like appreciating, I felt like this was like a very high quality of life for me to like get all this free stuff. And I was talking and drinking and eating, and it wasn't a good combination. And they had these cheese cubes about the size of a die or dice. And I had a few of those, and then one got stuck in my throat. And I knew I was choking. And so my instinct, and if anybody's on this call has ever choked, your instinct is to go somewhere private because it's pretty humiliating, and you don't want to be publicly embarrassed. But I had, growing up, I had worked in the oil fields of Alberta, and I watched, dozens of safety videos. And one of them I remembered, it like came back to my brain like instantly, is that the one thing you learn about choking is never leave the room, because that's how you'll die. Turns out that there's almost always somebody in a room who can save your life with the Heimlich. But our social instincts are to avoid humiliation. It's kind of one of the reasons people hate public speaking. Some people fear it more than death because they're worried about humiliating themselves in front of a bunch of peers. And so I stuck in the room. I kind of stumbled behind the bar, and the bartender, like I eventually communicated to him that I was choking, and he tried to help me, but it didn't fully work. And so I grabbed Dominic's hand to help me. And I couldn't even really talk at that point because, all the oxygen was cut off to my brain. And I pulled him to the men's room across the hall from the reception. And he was kind of horrified. He didn't know what to do. He didn't really realize I was even choking at first. But eventually I kind of like turned him around and put his arms, his hands on my stomach and started pushing. And eventually he realized what to do. And the cheese came out. And meanwhile, like we were like young students, we were kind of at the bottom of the totem pole, the pecking order. And there's professors coming in and out and like looking at us like, what are you guys doing in here? This is pretty weird. And so he saved me. And I remember after he saved me, I laughed. I thought this was like the most hilarious thing. I just like my career almost ended by choking to death at a wine and cheese. And Dominic was horrified. Like he looked like he had seen a ghost. He wanted to go home. He was upset. And I was like, no, let's go back in. There's still, food to be had. And it turns out that was the moment where our relationship kind of changed. We had this weird bond with each other. And from that point forward, when I'd be in the office and I'd share an idea with our other office mate, Dominic would slowly start turning around, engaging. And before long, we realized we had a lot of interests. And we've been, collaborating. I think that's 18 years ago this happened. So for 18 years, we've been, we've moved to the same places, became great friends, and now wrote a book together. And so it's one of these things that people can forge bonds over all kinds of experiences. And, in some tribal communities, this is what they do. They actively have people go through like these like really stressful, intense rituals to become members of, full-fledged members of the community. And so we kind of accidentally did this, but it was one of those things that bonded us together.
I love that story, and it's such a perfect opening because, as you said, it illustrates one of the ways that groups start to identify as groups. You talk in the book both about how identity can help us become better people and how it can lead us to turn against one another. And I wanted to ask you to sort of actually dig into both, but can we start first on the positive by talking a little bit about when identity can be helpful and why?
Yeah, so groups get a very bad rap. It turns out that they're part of our evolutionary DNA essentially is that we evolved in small groups, and humans aren't particularly strong or fast. We're not poisonous. We can't fly. Our evolutionary advantage is we can cooperate, unlike almost any other species on Earth. and communicate with each other. And so we can build amazing innovations, out compete, other species. And this has allowed us to spread around the world. And our main fear, as I mentioned before with the public speaking example, is getting socially ostracized, because our ancestors who did that died. They didn't live a very long life. And so our instinct is fundamentally to connect with other people. A lot of us have just become acutely aware of this during the pandemic, as we've all been forced to stay home. And so what that means is that, we have this instinct for pro-sociality and connection. And, you can look around the world and it's unlike anything our ancestors would have experienced, in part because we cooperated and earlier, our ancestors did and built all this, including the internet we're using, the computers, our ability to do all the things that we do in our daily life, is something that was completely unknown to humans up until, a couple hundred years ago. And so this is fundamentally what the value of social connection is. And there's lots of research showing that people who are identified with groups, it can do all kinds of good things. It can not only allow us to innovate, create, solve complex problems, but it also turns out it's really good for our physical and mental health. People who are part of communities have all these better indices on all kinds of measures of their health. This is what's often referred to as the social cure. It can also help us achieve our goals. I mean, one of the things I loved about your book was a lot of the things came down to identity, like resetting at certain dates allows us to build new identities. Or another example I liked of you had was your no group of women in academia who came together to help support each other to say no to the wrong things so they could focus and be successful. And, I'll go back to Dominic's book club, which was the launch of this whole thing for us, which is you join a book club, or the book club that we're starting right here today, I guess, is the first time you have an author on. That is a commitment device that is social, but gets you to do something that's often aspirational, which is almost everybody wants to read more, especially things that are going to make them smarter or better and solve the problems they care about. And that social commitment you have and support that you get from people in your book club helps you do that. And so these are just some of the, little things that matter with groups that can enrich our life in all kinds of ways.
Okay, I love starting with the upside because there is so much positivity and potential in groups. But of course, I have to turn us to the ugly underbelly, right? That identity groups can turn us against each other, become harmful, and it's particularly salient in this moment of polarization. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what science suggests we can do to try to combat that and prevent groups from creating harmful rifts.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's how most of us think about groups now. And you see this term in the media a lot about tribalism. One of the things we want to do is challenge that idea in our book, because certainly that's a potential for humans. We have a long history of intergroup conflict. You can look through, archaeological and anthropological records. You can look in every culture on Earth and you can see evidence of groupishness and a lot of times group conflict that can be really dangerous. What we try to communicate, however, is that doesn't need to be the case. And so one of the big things we're trying to get across to people is that the more you identify with a group doesn't necessarily make you discriminatory or exclusionary or conformist, in a way that leads to things like groupthink. It can do all those things. But what we talk about is the critical role of the norms of the group you identify with. So I'll give you 3 examples here and how that's powerful. The first one, just to kind of prime people's intuitions about this power, is if you're an American on this call, and admittedly I'm not, but I'm in New York, a very individualistic culture. And so America is known for pursuing your individual goals. A lot about individual freedom is part of the rhetoric, and many of us identify that way. And research by Yolanda Yetton and her colleagues finds that that's actually a form of conformity in itself. So the more you identify as American, the more you see yourself as an individualist. And so it's that identity when you come over, including if you're an immigrant to the country, the more you kind of acculturate and become identified with America, the more like you are to embrace that value of individualism. You can also use it to become more inclusive and embrace difference. And so it turns out there's great research showing that if you join a group where the norms are, embracing difference or valuing diversity, the more you identify with that group, the more you become inclusive and the less you discriminate. And I'll just give you some examples of that. So if you think of like a group like Doctors Without Borders, if you join that group and you start to buy into the norms and value system, the more you're willing to like put your own life at risk and incur costs to go to other countries to help people who are incredibly different from you, or the Red Cross is another example. And so there's lots of examples of that. And so one thing that I want to drive home and as a key part of our book is that leaders have a key role in creating those norms, and so do individuals, because even if leaders have like a vision statement on their website about what their company or their group stands for, people often look to those around them to determine what the norms are. And if they're in contrast with the vision statement or explicit values of the corporation, people will follow those social norms around them. And so this is where we exert a lot of power, whether we're a leader through our rhetoric and our example, or rewarding people who do these things that we actually say we value, or whether we look to our peers who have an office next to ours and see what they're doing. Those norms can guide us in really good ways or bad ways. And so that's why we think that like identity is part of it, but you have to fully understand how identity operates. And that's often through, when you identify the groups, it's the norms of the group that really seem to drive behavior.
I love that point. And actually, it gives me an opportunity to ask you about one of the parts of the book I found particularly fascinating. And I bet many people who are tuning in will find this interesting too, because I think a lot of people here know at least a little bit about social psychology. So you talk about the famous Stanford prison experiment and unpack some important misconceptions of that work that you helped identify. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how it ties to the key message of your book.
Yeah, so 50 years ago, this year, I believe, was in the basement of the Stanford psychology department. Phil Zimbardo and his colleagues were running maybe the most famous experiment in the history of social psychology, or maybe even psychology. It's in every textbook. And what happened is they brought these young men in, they flipped a coin and made them prisoners or guards. And within days, they found out that the guards were abusing and mistreating the prisoners and harassing them, locking them into this room, making them do demeaning exercises. And in fact, it got so toxic and cruel that they had to shut down the study in advance. And the main message from that's been pushed, from the very beginning of that work for the last 50 years is that if you just join a role, so the moment you put on that, like, if you're randomly assigned to put on like that prison guard uniform, and they had like these like reflective like aviator glasses, that moment, that norm and that role triggers you to be abusive and cruel. And so our behavior is powerfully determined by our roles in ways that we can't control. Well, it turns out that there was a major revelation a couple years ago. To his credit, Phil Zimbardo and his colleagues put a bunch of evidence from what happened in that study at the Stanford Library. And people started digging into that evidence, scholars and academics, and they found some missing pieces of evidence, including a recording of one of the superintendents of the prison talking to one of the guards. And what it revealed is that the guard did not want to engage in cruelty, but was getting enormous amounts of pressure from the leadership of the study. And there was two key lessons here. One is that the leadership seems to be really instrumental in creating cruelty. So it's not just that we automatically become cruel when we're in a role, it's that the messages and signals and norms that leaders are communicating are critical. The other thing about that recording was fascinating is that the way that leader was doing it, the superintendent, was framing this cruelty as serving a higher purpose. And so it was all like, we need you to work with us because we want to reform prisons. We all value that goal. And so we need you to be really aggressive in your treatment of the guards so we can like send this out into the press and have them like send this message to create prison reform. And so the guard, who was like super resistant to this authority, the whole time he was resisting, which was also really incredible, is that people just don't go along with leadership. Half the time they will resist it if they think it's going wrong. But the way leaders often get them on board is communicating to them that it's part of a higher purpose. And at that point, the ends justify the means. And so that's a really critical thing to know if you're thinking about building an organization that is, getting away from like toxic types of norms. A lot of times people are doing toxic behavior. It's not just purely self-interested. In fact, a lot of times, if you look around the world and throughout history, it's because people doing it think it's in the service of a higher purpose and they're doing it to benefit the group.
I loved that portion of the book. So much is wonderful in the book. I know lots of folks here have already read it, but for anyone who hasn't, highly recommend it. I'm going to turn now from my questions. We didn't get through all of them because I have so many, but it's time for me to be selfless and do something for the group and the greater good. And I'm going to turn some of the questions that are coming in. And I'll also just remind everyone, if you have questions, enter them in the Q&A and we will try our best to get to them. I'm going to start with a really interesting question from Tara Hoffman. So Tara wants to know if you're aware of identity development work in children that links to your work or research, and specifically she's interested in what gems educators could potentially take away from your work or from this research stream.
That's a great question. So there's a couple things. So I have done some work with kids, including at the New York Children's Museum. We've done some work in schools, looking at how this was that was with high schoolers, looking at how they all get on the same wavelength in schools. So maybe I'll share that study first. It was really cool. We went into this biology class for an entire semester every week. And the teacher in the class actually had a PhD in biology. And so they were very interested in working with scientists. And what happened is we put EEG caps on them. So we were measuring the brain activity of everybody in the classroom every week for an entire semester. And we found that when the teacher was engaging in, we had the teacher do, lecturing, watching movies, class discussion, reading silently. And we found when there was like class discussion or when the teacher was lecturing, and otherwise when it was social, we found that everybody in the class started to get on the same wavelength, which we could literally measure because we were measuring their brain activity. And that was associated with like deeper performance and engagement and happiness. And so things that get people engaged are often like those social things that send social messages and allow them to be included. The other thing that we found that was really cool was if you had even a brief social contact with somebody at the start of class. So for example, Katie, if like going into before a meeting, if you and I just like touch base for a minute about like how our weekend was, we were more likely to be on the same wavelength for the rest of the class. And so like a lot of the lessons we got from this were about social connection. And admittedly, this is obviously really hard during a pandemic. I mean, my kids are just now going back to school. But it's even those little connectors are things that get us on the same wavelength and increase our engagement and academic performance. So that I think is maybe one of the biggest things I found that's the most useful. So find ways to do that, enhance social connection, allow people to connect with each other even before the lesson starts, turns out to have measurable changes in how their brain is responding during the actual lesson.
It's so interesting and such a great lesson also for all leaders, right? That chit chat at the beginning that you're sort of trying to push past to get to your agenda actually has a really important function. Okay, another question from Marissa Barbara. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Marissa says that diversity is very, very welcome in many parts of our lives, and she wants advice on how to build group identity in a diverse group and how we can build identity, particularly when there are polarized subgroups already.
Yeah. So I will say, I mean, I could speak on this for an hour, but I'll try to give you a couple key studies that I think are really important. First of all, most of us are now aware that diverse groups often can outperform other groups because they have different perspectives and it avoids things like groupthink. And often it allows us to have like blind spots that are otherwise saved by having diverse perspectives in the room. So those things are really critical. One of my favorite studies on this, however, found that that's only true of diverse groups who felt a shared sense of purpose or identity. And most of us, if we've been on a diverse group and those people don't get along and don't feel like they're working for something together at a higher purpose, they don't perform better. And so you really need, that's why a lot of D&I efforts include the D, the diversity, and the inclusion piece. If you don't have the inclusion piece, you don't really harness the benefits of diversity. And then another piece, and this is important as schools and workforces are diversifying, universities, is that when I'm talking about having a higher order identity, so for me, let's say that's at NYU, I'm trying to get my colleagues on board to something, and I try to frame it as we're gonna situate ourselves relative to other departments or the universities in a way that's gonna make us better. It's also important not to quash or suppress the lower order identities that people have when they come to work. And so research, for example, on prejudice reduction strategies finds that those are most effective if people feel a common sense of identity at a higher level, but also feel like they can express their personal or minority identities. If not, what you often have is a majority group that is imposing its identity on minority group members. And so you have to be careful not to do that if you're creating a superordinate identity, or you won't get buy-in. And you can obviously, you'll lose people. They won't stick around in that type of environment if they don't feel like they're valued. So those are a couple things. And then a third thing I'll say, again, going to norms. This is one of my favorite studies on this. It was a study at Google where they looked at what made the most effective teams. They looked at over 200 teams, and Google's famous for crunching numbers and like analyzing data, and they found almost no pattern in the data whatsoever that predicted what teams succeed. Personality characteristics weren't really predicting it. Leadership style, hierarchical or vertical or horizontal, didn't predict it. Whether you go for drinks after, like you're good friends or not, didn't predict it. The one thing they found that predicted team success, that made teams greater than the sum of their parts, was psychological safety, which a lot of people don't understand what that term means, but that term means that you get to share a perspective that might be different, challenge the status quo, constructively criticize a friend or a colleague, and you're invited back to the group the next day. In other words, you're intrinsically valued. You're not walking on eggshells. You're not biting your tongue. And so those are groups where performance excels and they perform greater than the sum of their parts. So that's another piece of diversity, is creating that sense of safety so that everybody feels like they have a voice.
It's a great lesson. All right, here's a somewhat related but slightly different question from Sushma Konap. Sushma is asking, when you have an in-group, you automatically create an out-group. And so the question is, are there good ways to limit animosity towards out-groups while still preserving the benefits of in-groups?
Yeah, so this is often what you see when you look out at the world, and you see like intractable conflict in parts of the world, or in this country, any country you live in, you can find examples. So one of the ways that we study this in the lab, dates back 50 years, is we create minimal groups. We flip a coin and create two teams in the lab. And I've done this with many, many studies at 4 universities now, multiple countries. And what you find is that when you create a new team, they don't necessarily dislike outgroup members. The first kind of like instinct when people join a group is just to look for and embrace and engage with in-group members. This can lead to discrimination, of course, right? Because you can give more resources to in-group members and out-group members, but it doesn't necessarily come with out-group derogation, which is what we're often more worried about. However, the second piece of it is, once you create that group, you want to be sure that you find ways to create, if you don't want to have discrimination, is create goals or rewards that are structured on cooperation with outgroups. And I'll give an example from organizations. Is you sometimes get like teams or groups that are competing with each other for resources or for status or for pride or whatever, for the boss's approval. And if they're doing that, they won't cooperate. They will sabotage each other. And this was work led by Meena Chikara, who's a collaborator of mine. She's at Harvard. We ran these studies and we found over and over again, once people create groups and once they're competing with another group, that's when you get like a lack of empathy towards the outgroup. But we found 2 things got rid of it. One is that if you get them cooperating and working together towards a higher order goal, you immediately feel empathy towards outgroup members who normally you'd be opposed to and lacking empathy. And then the other thing that we found got rid of it is communicating to people that the social networks that people had were actually interconnected and embedded. A lot of people assumed that the social networks of the 2 groups were non-overlapping. They assume that, oh, everybody's friends in this group and no one has friends in the other group. But if you show them evidence that that's not true, they shift how they think about the other group. They suddenly realize, oh, I can connect with them too and value them because other people on my group in my team do. So those are at least 2 potential solutions to that.
Really interesting. Okay, we have a most popular question that seems like a hard one, but I'm going to ask it because so many people want me to. This is from Jane Yi asking about COVID and our experience with COVID. So the question is, considering the extreme experience we've all just been through and the deep divides that are also arising, it's a prediction question. Do you predict that COVID will become a bonding historic event or a divisive one when historians look back and think about this moment in time, and why?
I predict, well, what you've seen has happened around the world is that in some countries, in the US in particular, it's become divided, it's become polarized. Pretty much every stage of the pandemic from January 2020 to now, there's polarization in perceived risk was the first issue politically, and then it was distancing, and I've studied this in my own lab. We analyzed, millions of 15 million people moving around the country. We were able to track their movement and found that was one of the biggest predictors in our whole study was, were you from a red county or a blue county, predicted social distancing. Then it was with masks, now it's with vaccines. So that's been divisive, but I'll give you a counterexample. It didn't have to be that way. So in Canada, where I'm from, Canada is different than the US in a lot of ways, but it's right across the border. It's very similar. And they have political polarization too. They have the 2 dominant parties are liberal and conservative. And there was a really cool paper analyzing the rhetoric of leaders from both parties at the start of the pandemic on like social media. And everybody took it seriously, no matter what your political leaning was, from politicians from both parties. And what they found was that when they looked at surveys of all Canadians, it didn't matter what party you had, everybody took it seriously. And so what the messaging was non-polarized when it came from leaders. And so that led people who identify with those groups to both take it seriously. And there was a really cool analysis from Penn, actually, from the medical school, suggesting that if the US had handled the pandemic just as well as Canada had, it would have saved, I think it was like 100,000 lives. And that was like from a year ago. At this point, it might have saved 300,000 lives. And so there was a potential for reducing polarization, but the messaging here is that it takes leadership. And maybe my favorite person on this is the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. At the beginning of the pandemic, she framed up the issue as a national crisis, and she tried to bring people together. She famously referred to New Zealanders as her team of 5 million. There's a famous moment where, and this is key to good leadership too, is, you know, when they were reopening everything after they kind of suppressed the pandemic, she wanted to go out for brunch. You know, it was kind of like a photo op opportunity to show that everything's safe again. And they had distanced all the tables at the place she was going to go for brunch. And there wasn't room for her without violating the new distancing guidelines. And so what can you imagine what most leaders would do? Most prime ministers or presidents would be like, their handlers would be like, make a table for them. We're here. We're going to get a picture of this. This is critical for PR. She left because she wanted to follow the own rules that she had set. And so and then eventually someone left and then they grabbed her and brought her back. But the point is that leaders also have to live up to the rules that they set for people, because you're not going to get buy-in from people if they think that leaders are playing by a different set of rules. And this has happened in many states and countries where leaders set these rules and you find out they're at like a really fancy dinner where they've told everybody else they're not supposed to go for dinners. So you have to have not only the rhetoric, but then their behavior has to match it.
Awesome. I really love that particular example you held up, and it's so clear how differently this has been handled by different leaders. We have two questions that are related, and they both have to do with dealing with resolving conflict when there's multiple identities involved. So curious about what you think people can do when they have multiple overlapping identities and they need to navigate those. If you have any advice for how people can sort of switch from one role to the next, or how leaders can manage it when their employees or the people they're coaching or mentoring have multiple identities that come into conflict when trying to decide on how to move forward.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say this is one of the core themes of our book, which is that we borrow the quote from the poet Walt Whitman, that we contain multitudes. All of us have multiple identities. Those identities are often in conflict. So I'll just use myself. Like, I'm at work right now. I'm probably operating from the identity of a professor, or maybe my new identity as an author, which is brand new, and you get treated differently. And all of a sudden you're like in these in-groups of all these authors who are very supportive, which is really cool. But the moment I like go home tonight and I'm with my kids, the moment I walk in that door, pick them up from school, they don't care how many books I sold or what papers I published or anything. All they really care about is like, what's for dinner, Dad? What are we going to do tonight? Can you help me with my homework? And are we going to like do something fun this weekend? And so your identity shifts really dramatically in the moment you're in that new situation. And situations are one of the powerful ways identities shift. And then the other thing is, now that a lot of people are working from home, all our identities are kind of on screen. You know, right now I can see into Katie's like living room, like I have access to you in a personal way that I never would have had before. Like I had this story of how I got stuck kind of bringing my kids home from school during the pandemic, and we were coming up in the elevator. I was racing to teach my class from my kitchen table, which is where I was teaching a class of 300 people. And the elevator got stuck. And we were trapped in the elevator, and it was the class before the midterms. And I knew my poor students would be stressed and anxious about it. They're already stressed enough with the pandemic. And I called in and taught the class to my cell phone. My poor kids were like stuck there watching me while we're trapped in an elevator waiting for the repair person to come. And that was like, you're trying to keep these identities separate. And sometimes through circumstances that we can't control, they come into conflict. And this happens with a lot of like working parents and all kinds of people. A challenge often with minority individuals is code switching, that they feel like they have to live up to norms that don't match their ethnic or religious identity at work. And it's really stressful and challenging. And so I think one of the things to just understand from the get-go and probably give way more support for in latitude now than maybe you have in the past, and hopefully this will become more normal, is signaling to people that you support these different identities. It's really important when leaders do that, when they signal it. And I will say this other weird thing. I was just walking up into work this morning and I ran into one of my students from that class, and I haven't seen any of those students, right? Because it was taught all virtual. He said, Dr. Van Bavel, and I said hi, and he introduced himself, and he said he was in that class. And he reminded me it was like the class that I was stuck in the elevator. And he thought it was such a cool story and so funny. And I thought at the time it was really embarrassing and unprofessional and stressful. But what it did is also it kind of like connected me to students. I got the best ratings, I think, of anytime I've ever taught that course, because everybody was going through stressful stuff that semester. And normally professors are at a distance from their students. And it made us human in a way that we probably weren't to them, and also helped us kind of resonate with what they were going through and the stressors in their personal lives as they were struggling to do this all online without their friends and stuff. And so I think that that's something that's really important, is communicating that we're all human, we all have multiple identities, and that's okay. And in fact, that's part of who we all are. And we should just try to figure out a better way of embracing it. As long as you get the work done. And it's sometimes better if you can be more open about those different identities you have.
I love that you found a way to weave that elevator story in, because that is, by the way, I'm going to ask our team if someone could put a link to the tweet at the beginning of that thread. I think it was one of the most viral tweets in our field last year, and it deserved it. That was an amazing story. And I loved also that you said recently you found out it had been actually used as an example of good writing on Twitter in a textbook. It was great.
This English professor from Stanford, like the director of the writing program, put it in a book on like good writing, just like you can do good writing on social media. And I was like, I've never seen that in an English textbook in my life. This will be the only time anybody says I'm a good writer for something. And I'm like, I'm taking that win.
It was awesome. I loved it. And it really was. I remember being riveted as I scrolled through that tweet stream as it was happening. And I've never been stuck in an elevator to teach, but I still somehow, I felt connected and bonded just imagining it. Okay, I think we have time maybe for one last question before Angela is going to come back and tell us about what's next and so on. And I'm going to selfishly just steal back the mic and ask you my last burning question, which is, and this is sort of partly based on my own journey of writing a book, I'm very curious about what unanswered questions you found yourself wishing you could answer after sort of doing the step back, looking at all of the literature, synthesizing it for your book. What does it make you want to know? What kinds of questions are you hoping to answer in your research, or hoping others will answer moving forward now that you've seen at a bird's eye view everything we really know about identity and the power of us?
Yeah, so one thing that, and I'll connect this, maybe even zoom out to the Behavior Change for Good initiative, is that one thing that I want to do in the next range, next 5 or 10 years of my research, something that the center stand for, it's something that's embodied in your work. One of the things that resonated when I was reading your book is applying these ideas at scale with real behavior. And I know we've debated like a lot of the studies in psychology are based on people's attitudes and self-reports, and that's often a really good first pass, but it's much more powerful when you can look at behavior and do it at scale. And I would say in the last 5 years, I've been moving more and more to real behavior, especially measuring like mass behavior online or in multiple countries. But that's, I think the next wave is like putting these ideas to test in ways that can affect people and create behavior change for good, but in like a measurable way. So we can see like, how much can we reduce toxic behavior in a workplace? How much can we like change the norms to promote like healthy dissent so we can like avoid groupthink in some kind of measurable way? And so I think for me, that's the vision of the next 5 or 10 years that I'd love to do more. And I feel like the behavioral economics field, the behavioral science field has been really moving in that direction the last 5 years. And I just am really inspired by it, by these huge studies with real behavior. And I just think that's the future of the best science. And so I think that the stuff on groups needs to be taken there and put to the test and see where it's going to make a positive change and maybe where it won't.
Well, that is a very exciting way to wrap, I think, because hopefully it means we get to collaborate a lot. I would love that. And I was expecting you to say, I'm thinking about this particular hypothesis, but I love that it's let's take it to scale. We have all these great ideas and so much knowledge we've built in the lab. And fMRI machines, and now let's go apply it and make the world a better place. So yay. And I see Angela has come back, although she's a very small dot on my screen. Oh, yeah, big. Welcome
I'm
back.
back. And Jay, I hope your ears were burning, because just a couple of days ago, we were saying your name over and over again, because we agree with you. That is the future of behavior change of groups, not of individuals. So everybody should go change their behavior and buy this amazing book. Whether you're a leader, a mom, a dad, a teacher, I think you'll find something. I also want to tee up another great book from a BCFG scientist, Eric Johnson, from Columbia, and I just made my own version of his book. It's not out yet, but I took a, PDF and I just wrapped it around. This is available for pre-order on Amazon. It's coming out next month, and we are so excited that Eric himself, as well as his interviewer, in this case, another BCFG scientist, Colin Kammerer, will be in conversation 3 weeks from today. That's Friday, October 15th, again at noon. So join us and bring a friend.
Yay. And Jay, thank you so much for spending your lunch 45 minutes with us. We loved this. This was such a fun conversation. I loved the book, but I learned even more from having this dialogue with you, and I hope everyone else had as much fun as I did.
Thank you both so much for having me. And I have to say, it's been really touching to me just to be embraced by other authors, especially really successful authors by yourself. And I feel like there's this whole other identity idea I have now, and these other groups of people, and they've been actually maybe the author world that I'm now in is actually a really good example I was thinking of last night, is like a group that's actually really supportive, unconditionally supportive, inclusive, open and honest about what their struggles were and ways to help each other. And it's a really good example of just like a great identity to have. And the people who are modeling it, at least in the encounters I've had, are really inspiring. I hope to pay it forward if there's future authors on this call. When it's your turn, let me know and I'll do what I can to offer advice or support.
Thanks, Jay. All right, we'll let everyone go. Thank you so much. This was such a treat. Go read Power of Us. It's amazing. And we'll see you in a month. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Katie. Bye, Jay.